Mike, given the post-Brexit circumstances remaining unclear, what is Import Services' view in terms of contingency planning for transition?
Well, I think Import Services is in a rather privileged position, really close to the container port of Southampton, and with all our sites, all three of them, customs bonded. So this means we can hold our clients' stocks free of VAT and duty, which is only payable, of course, after our clients have made a sale. And then on the ordered quantity at the end of the transactional month. Our practices of managing order flows intra-Europe, EU and outside customs areas is already established, as of course is order tracking, documentation and reporting systems for that purpose. So in terms of planning, we envisage a programme of expansion to accommodate the growth, and we'll be doing this principally around our dockside facility, moving from around 30,000 pallets to 60,000 pallets in due course. Scale is important here because as the ships become ever larger and the calls slightly less frequent, then we need the capacity and scope to be able to bring in imported product for the UK, ERA and continental Europe and have the scale to manage these large influxes.
You mentioned doubling the capacity of the container port. What kind of support have you been given from maybe the port to allow for this increasing capacity?
Well, this is very embryonic. We are just looking at the planning permission currently, but the vision is because of the symbiotic relationship between the container port itself, there is a need, in fact, to improve and increase the ability for retail logistics facilities in the immediate environment, and we're sitting in this privileged position to be able to capitalise on that, and all vested parties are keen that we do so.
What will be your biggest known challenge posed by Brexit, and how are you planning to mitigate this?
The Brexit situation, if you take it in essence, we're starting from full membership of the EU, which is a mutually beneficial trading model should emerge post-transition, all being well, because we are keen, as our continental counterparts will be, to create a trading agreement which is as frictionless as possible. I know over time there's been a great deal of posturing between Barnier and the other negotiators around the table, and everybody is saying, well, we will get the best deal for their respective camps. But in any agreement, it really does require some compromise on both sides. But in essence, both sets, the UK and the EU, have 40 years of entwined relationships, very complex supply chains across many different sectors, not only in retail where we're particularly positioned, but if you take the automotive industry all the way through petrochemicals, heavy industries, services as well, financial and otherwise, education, training. There's so many intertwined relationships. It's going to be in both parties' interest to come up with a sensible trading agreement. What we have to do, of course, is try and somehow separate the free movement of folk between borders with the free movement of goods and services. On the EU side, that is a bit of a red line. Currently on our side, politically, it's deemed important to be able to control the movement of people. But between those two situations, I am absolutely convinced in the transitional period, which commences in March 19, a sensible commercial trading agreement will emerge for all parties involved.
And do you think that's going to be driven by industry or politicians?
I think in terms of the parties I've been involved with, and that's through the UKWA, also looking at HMRC, government officials and industrial heads of industry, keen on trying to navigate their way through the next 2 to 3 years to get to some clarity on the way forward. Nonetheless, for actually investment, which has been certainly something that's stalled a little while people deliberate upon this. But I think if anything will drive this, it's going to be commercially driven. It's going to be business that drives it. I think the politicians will eventually give way to sense and sensibility in terms of a practical trading agreement and the ability to move as frictionless as possible across frontiers. Now, what we have as a business, Import Services, we already hold our products VAT and duty free, as I think I mentioned earlier. We can electronically clear at the point of delivery to the VAT regime that's required, and we have the systems to be able to achieve this. The physicality of how that translates with potential queues at frontiers, and I think you mentioned about what would be the biggest concern, and this would be, I suppose, the elongation of order cycle times. And what would that mean? That would possibly mean folk having to think about stocking more to create the buffer to enable still a just-in-time delivery to take place, but with more stock potentially in the supply chain, which actually cuts across the grain of where retail logistics in particular is heading. So the physical movement from A to B may be a concern if we end up being in a non-frictionless arrangement. But my feeling and my belief is that the closer we get to 19 March, the model will appear which is far more sensible and much more practically based, which will alleviate a lot of these concerns.
Okay, reports are circulating that post-Brexit we will see lorry queues and long delays at our ports. What are your views on this?
Well, the two things that are happening, some contingency planning is taking place. We're looking at holding pens for vehicles down on the areas close to main freight corridors in the Dover area, for example, the M20. There's also a possibility of improving and increasing the training rapidly for the UK government officials and customs personnel that may well be required. I still feel this is a retrograde step, and we may have to contingency plan for a cliff edge, but I do feel with electronic solutions, moving products across borders using a bit of technology, we can overcome many of the fear factors that are surrounding these sort of long lorry queues and the whole thing grinding to a halt. Both trading partners can't afford for that to happen, quite frankly, and I think we'll work very hard over the next few years to make sure it doesn't.
Do you think the situation surrounding a potential Irish border will have implications for both British and Irish businesses?
Look, I think politically, reintroduction of a border in Ireland is unacceptable, and this is just not anticipated at all. There will always be an open trading arrangement between the north and the south, and I think if any sort of control comes in, looking at the movement of freight or people, it may have to take place through airports or ferry ports, or while potentially folk are on a ferry, on a boat in transit. But we've already made I think politically a comment to say that the UK would not introduce a border within its own territory, i.e. between Northern Ireland and the UK mainland. That would be not acceptable, and again, the open border between the north and the south in Ireland must remain as such, because we have spent many years, and obviously everybody understands and knows about the history there. We must not reintroduce that under any circumstance. So there will be a separate arrangement for all vested parties again, to keep that border open.
On the same theme, do you foresee Irish retailers buying directly from European suppliers to bypass British border and customs issues?
Well, I think the markets will always determine, how trade patterns change. We are in a very privileged position in the UK, whereby the pattern of trade, there's an imbalance of transport capacity, so that our ability to move product through the UK onto the continent is actually very cost effective for hubbing in the UK. I think the movement between north-south or UK and Ireland will continue unabated, and I can't really sit here and forecast what market economics looks like post-Brexit, because obviously we're not clear yet what the trading model will look like. But as with every market economy, it's going to be the economics that drives the pattern of demand and supply.
You've mentioned before about IT systems, but how will IT systems and technology need to adapt to a likely increase in the central government's requirement for greater transparency?
The systems themselves will need to be capable of expanding in terms of real-time transactions, and I suspect the future will be RFQ type barcoding, not only on packaging but potentially on pallets and containers. So freight moving around between jurisdictions will be tracked electronically, and although the cost of doing so currently is still quite expensive, I can see the demand and the sheer quantum of movements in terms of the volumes driving a price down to an acceptable level, where this will become really part of the overall supply chain from origin to final destination, which then means how does that electronic systems capture and where does it centralize? Well, again, we already have scanning technology at courier hubs. Scanning technology, I'm sure you've all seen at airports. It doesn't seem to me to be too far away to introduce barcoding and chip technology with real-time tracking for freight, which would allow cross-border movement, but in a controlled manner, which I think is probably the right way to describe it. And I don't see that being an onerous position at all for either the UK customs officials or the EU.
Reports have indicated a 5-fold increase in customs declarations. Will UK officials be able to find the extra staff required to cope with this in time for Brexit?
Yeah, I think that's probably a real volume estimation. In terms of actually controlling it, though, I think we'd have to be a bit more adept at looking at technology to help us. I don't think you can throw people at this. I don't think it's sensible, and I don't think it's the way that the future will look for supply chains across trading blocks. So I think the technology side cannot be underestimated, and certainly that's an area that Import Services is investing in quite heavily, to be able to have the ability to track and control and report on freight moving. And I think once real-time technology takes place and becomes more prevalent, this will be the way that the whole thing shapes up for the future.
Okay, a question now with regard to labour specifically. Import Services employ staff from several European countries, as well as the UK. How will this labour flow be affected?
It already has been affected to some extent. When the Brexit vote was announced, and it was obviously a huge surprise. Sterling devalued significantly. It's bounced back a little bit since, but the pound earned and converted to the local currency, certainly euros or further afield, reduced significantly, and that has then, coupled with quite a bit of uneasiness surrounding what Brexit might look like, uncertainty led a number of our long-term Polish, very valued operational staff to think about their futures and where they should base themselves, particularly as some of the EU economies were looking a little brighter, stronger. But in saying that, Southampton is a great bastion, certainly for the Polish community, and we have a number of our staff settled here with children at school, and an environment that they appreciate, and we certainly appreciate and value our teams here. So it hasn't been a wholesale change, but we have seen it on the fringes, and it's more difficult now to obtain really talented, skilled agency people, but happily, because of our position and the way that we take care of our teams, permanent and temporary, we've been quite heartened actually by the general help from many of our long-established teams staying with us.
Okay, we've got some questions now from third party. I'll introduce this bit later in post-production, so I'm just going to dive straight into the questions, Mike. And finally, is the chaos predicted by the Remainers likely to happen?
It's how long is a piece of string. I really seriously believe the politicians, as I mentioned earlier, will be driven by the practicalities and the economics of life. Business will see its way through here, and I don't see a cliff edge. I think the transition will take as long as it takes. I know 2 years has been banded about, so that could stretch to 3 years. I think a trading arrangement has to be practical, it has to help both sides, and I don't think any politician would relish driving us into a chaotic position, because that regime of the politicians would change very quickly, and at the end of the day, the well-being of societies on both sides of the channel and the economic well-being of both sets and groups will always come to the fore.
Thank you very much.
Great pleasure.